Joining us now is Sherrilyn Ifill. She's the President and Director Counsel of the NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Sherrilyn Ifill, it is great to have you with us tonight. I have thought that you are always one of my favorite people to talk to on basically anything, but your leadership and your eloquence and your seeing around corners for this past week has been really inspiring and really constructive. So I'm glad you were able to make time to be here.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you.
In terms of seeing around those corners, not to put any pressure on you, can I just ask you your sort of best case scenario for how constructively this could potentially resolve? I feel differently about it when I look at some of the mass peaceful protests that we saw today, for example, in St. Paul, than I do when I see what the president said tonight at the White House, what the president did tonight at the White House. I feel very torn in terms of my emotions and whether or not I should be optimistic or pessimistic. What do you think is the best case scenario here?
Well, thank you, Rachel. It's actually difficult to imagine the best case scenario, given all of the circumstances that are surrounding us. But as you point out, I always try to see through to the core. And the most important thing, I think, is that all of us have acknowledged that we feel differently. You know, I've been here before. I've been working on police abuse issues for a very long time. I've seen more videos than most Americans would care to see, and I've seen them from every angle. And this one, the killing of George Floyd, even took me to a different place, moved me in a different way. And I said earlier, I think it's because when I watched that officer taking the life of George Floyd with his hands in his pockets, looking out in that way, it was apparent to me that he did not think anything would happen to him. And that is a failure of law. I want to stop talking about training. You can't do anything with that officer. I don't want to talk about the talk because I can't prepare my children to encounter someone like that. The failure of law, of accountability, has allowed officers like that to believe that they can commit these acts with impunity. And as we've seen, as the protests have unfolded, and we've seen the kind of brutality with which many protesters have been greeted, many peaceful protesters have been greeted, there is an impunity problem here. And so I think the best case scenario is that out of this terrible devastation and pain comes our attention to dealing with what is the fault in our laws. We need to deal with the defense of qualified immunity that allows officers essentially to raise this judge-made defense that is operating in a way that is allowing them to not be accountable for their unconstitutional conduct. We have to deal with creating laws around the use of force by officers. We have to create a national database of police officers who are engaged in misconduct. This officer, Derek Chauvin, had 18 complaints against him. And as we know, many officers who are even fired end up going to another department and getting hired. So we have to decertify officers so that you can never again have a badge and a gun and a shield and the power to take life on behalf of the state. So we've got to really lean in to the legal apparatus that has allowed this to happen. People should remember that the way we got the law that allows the Department of Justice to engage in pattern and practice investigations of police departments, that was legislation that came after the unrest following the verdicts in the Rodney King case, the Law Enforcement Misconduct Act. And that allowed the Department of Justice under Attorney General Holder and Attorney General Lynch to do investigations of Ferguson, to do investigations of Baltimore and put Baltimore under a consent decree. That law now sits on a shelf gathering dust in the Department of Justice because Bill Barr is more interested in car washes in Maine and church services and what he calls Antifada. But out of this can come a legal regime that will demand accountability for officers, and it will also wake up the population. I think people are seeing now, because of the response to the protests and because of this terrible video, what African Americans have been saying for so long. And they've seen it not just against the individual who was killed, George Floyd, but they've also seen it against people who've been protesting, the kind of brutality that they've seen. And so I think what will come out of this is an understanding that this country has gone too far in the latitude that it has given law enforcement to manage itself. And it's time for us as a democracy to come together and recalibrate our vision of public safety.
Sherrilyn Ifill, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund. it's, again, an honor to have you here. I appreciate you being with us on such an important night as we continue to watch these major, and at this point right now, peaceful protests across the country. Thank you for being here.